I want to be clear about something before we begin. I am not a romantic bird. I do not sit on windowsills and sing about the beauty of the morning. I do not perch on the shoulders of important people and whisper wisdom into their ears. I am a house sparrow. I eat what I find. I sleep where it is warm. I have lived inside the eastern wall of the Sandringham agricultural outbuilding for 11 years, and in that time I have observed a great many things with no particular emotional investment in any of them. Tractors rusting, seasons turning, one particularly optimistic barn cat named something like Gerald who spent the better part of 3 winters convinced he could catch me. He could not. He has since retired to the kitchen garden, where he bothers the rabbits instead, and we have reached a mutual understanding that involves him pretending I do not exist and me flying directly over his head whenever possible. I tell you all of this because I need you to understand that when I say the morning the old Duke brought the small boy into the map room was different, I mean it in the way a bird who has seen 11 years of ordinary mornings means it. Not as poetry, as observation. The way I can tell from the way the wind moves through the Norfolk fields that rain is coming before the clouds have even agreed on a direction. The way I know, before the tractor starts, whether it is going to start properly, or whether it is going to make that particular coughing sound that means Ted the groundskeeper is going to be standing in the yard saying words I will not repeat in a story that may be read aloud to children. I know things I watch, that is what I do. And what I watched, on that particular Tuesday morning in October, was a grandfather and his grandson walking together across the estate yard in the low, pale light that Norfolk does better than anywhere else on earth. That specific shade of gold that arrives in autumn and apologizes for the summer ending by being briefly, quietly magnificent. The old Duke walked the way he always walks, steadily, without hurry, like a man who has learned that the world does not reward rushing and has made his peace with that fact so thoroughly that it has become simply the way his legs work. The boy walked differently. He walked slowly, but not in the way of a child who is bored or reluctant. He walked slowly in the way of a child who is paying attention to something that has not yet fully revealed itself. His head was slightly forward. His hands were in his pockets. Every few steps he would glance up at his grandfather and then back at the ground and then at the outbuilding door ahead of them, as though he was calculating something he didn't quite have the equation for yet. I have seen that look on very few people in 11 years. I pressed my eye to the gap in the stone wall, the good gap, the one at eye level when I am standing on my particular ledge, and I did not move for the rest of the morning. When you have watched as many ordinary things as I have watched, you develop a sense for when something is about to be extraordinary. It is not magic. It is pattern recognition. It is 11 years of data telling you that this particular Tuesday is not like the other Tuesdays. The door to the map room opened. The morning walked in with them. I stayed very, very still. The map room is not a grand room. I want to be honest about that, because there is a version of this story that would have you imagining a sweeping library with tall windows and leather chairs and the hushed reverence of a cathedral. And while I understand the appeal of that version, it is not the room I have spent 11 years living beside. The map room is a working room. Stone floor, low ceiling, 2 wooden work tables worn smooth by decades of use. Shelves along every wall, built deep enough to hold the long rolled cases that house the maps themselves. It smells of time. That is the only way I can describe it. Not of must exactly, though there is an element of that. Not of damp, though the Norfolk air finds its way into everything eventually. It smells of time the way very old things smell of time, like something that has been still long enough that the stillness itself has become a scent. Like opening a door that has been closed for 30 years and breathing in all the years that happened on the other side of it. The maps on those shelves go back to the early 1800s. Each one is a record, not just of land but of thought, of how the people who farmed this estate understood the fields they worked. Drainage ditches mapped with extraordinary care, Crop rotations noted in handwriting so precise it looks, to my eye, like the writer was afraid the letters might escape the page. Field boundaries drawn with the confidence of people who believed that if you recorded a thing carefully enough, you could hold onto it forever. Which is, of course, both true and not true, but we will get to that. The old Duke moved through the room the way he moves through all rooms, without performing the movement. He lifted a map case from the shelf, unrolled it with practiced hands onto the work table, and held the edges flat with the calm certainty of a man who has done this many times and sees no need to make it look more complicated than it is. George stood beside him. The boy looked at the map the way I am searching for the right comparison here, the way you look at something when your brain is receiving more information than it has categories for. Not confusion exactly. More like the moment just before understanding arrives, when you can feel it coming but it hasn't landed yet. The old Duke began to explain. I cannot hear through stone walls with the precision of a recording device. I catch words, phrases, the rhythm of a voice. And what I caught in the low and unhurried explanation the old Duke gave his grandson that morning was the particular rhythm of someone explaining not just what a thing is, but why it matters. There is a difference. Most people, when they explain things, explain what? The old Duke, from what I could gather through 11 years of peripheral observation, tends to explain why. It takes longer. It requires more trust in the listener. Children, in my experience, respond to it the way plants respond to the right amount of water, with a kind of opening that you can almost watch happen in real time. George leaned forward over the map. He asked a question. I caught the shape of it but not the words. The old Duke pointed to something on the lower left corner of the map. George leaned closer. His nose was approximately 4 inches from the paper, and some part of his grandfather's decade of instinct must have communicated itself without words because the boy stopped, just barely, before going closer still. Then the old Duke moved to the back shelf. The damaged ones. He lifted a case down and set it on the second work table, and opened it with a care that told me, before I even saw what was inside, that this was different from the first map. The way you handle a thing tells you everything about how much it costs to lose it. The map inside was damaged. I could see it clearly through my gap in the wall, the gray-brown bloom of damp across the lower third, the way the paper had warped, and in places partially separated, the colors of the original ink still visible underneath the damage like a voice trying to be heard through a wall. George looked at it for a long time. Then he said something, short, a question from the shape of it. The old Duke looked at his grandson, then at the map, then back at his grandson. He smiled, not a large smile, a small one, the kind that means the question was a good one. And then he went to the cupboard by the door and began to take out tools. The tools of paper restoration are not dramatic. I will tell you what they are, because the specificity matters. Because part of what George was learning that morning was that the specificity always matters, that the difference between saving something and destroying it lives in the details that impatient people skip over. Japanese tissue paper, thinner than you can imagine if you have not seen it, almost not there. The way early morning mist is almost not there. It is used to reinforce damaged areas without adding weight, without changing the character of what is underneath. When it is applied correctly, it becomes part of the thing it is saving, invisible and essential. Wheat starch paste, not glue, not any modern adhesive with its aggressive chemistry and its permanent intentions. Wheat starch paste because it is reversible, because the first principle of paper restoration, the old Duke explained, is that you must never do anything that cannot be undone. Future restorers must be able to return to this moment and try again. Every intervention must leave the door open. Soft brushes, the kind used for watercolor painting. Narrow enough that the ferrule, the metal band holding the bristles, could be laid flat against paper without the edge catching. The bristles themselves had been worn to a particular softness by years of use. New brushes are too assertive. These brushes had learned over time to suggest rather than insist. And a small humidifier, because paper, the old Duke explained, is not as rigid as it appears. Paper has memory. Paper has preferences. Paper that has been warped by damp can be persuaded slowly, with moisture and gentle weight, to remember what it used to be. George listened to all of this. He did not fidget. He did not look at the door. He asked two questions that I caught fragments of, one about the paste, one about the tissue paper, and both times the old Duke's answer was longer than a simple question usually earns, which told me the questions were better than simple. Then came the first attempt. The old Duke demonstrated first. A small section, a tier no longer than my wing, running diagonally across what had once been a carefully inked field boundary. He cut a piece of Japanese tissue to size, slightly larger than the tier, with edges torn rather than cut so that the join would be softer, less visible. He mixed a small amount of paste. He explained each step in the voice of a man who has learned that explanation and demonstration must happen simultaneously, or one of them becomes theoretical. Then he handed George the brush. George took it. He looked at the tier. He looked at the tissue paper, he looked at the brush, he looked at his grandfather. And then he sneezed. Not a small, polite, contained sneeze. A full, wholehearted, entire-body sneeze of the kind that old paper dust, disturbed after years of stillness, apparently specializes in producing. The brush flew from his hand. It landed, bristles down, on the work table. Not on the map. I want to make that clear. Not on the map, but near it, close enough that both the old Duke and the small boy went very still for a moment, in the specific way of people who have just survived something by a margin they are not yet ready to calculate. Then George picked up the brush. He looked at his grandfather. His grandfather looked at him. Something passed between them, something in the category of understood without being said. They began again. Ted has worked on the Sandringham estate for 23 years. He is a good man, a genuinely good man, which I say not as a courtesy, but as an observation built on 2 decades of watching him work. He knows the fields the way the old maps know the fields, not as abstraction, but as lived reality, as mud and weather, and the particular stubbornness of certain drainage ditches in February. He can tell you the name of every tree on the estate over 40 years old, and the approximate age of most of them. He once spent an entire afternoon helping a family of ducks navigate from a flooded lower field back to the main pond, without letting any of them know they were being herded, which I consider a significant achievement. He is, however, not always what you would call spatially cautious. He is a large man. He moves through spaces with the confidence of someone who has never, in 23 years, broken anything he cared about breaking, which, to be fair, is largely true, but has not historically accounted for situations where he was carrying something that other people cared about. I heard him coming before he knocked. This is the thing about Ted. He is not a quiet man, not because he is trying to be loud, simply because he exists in the world with a wholehearted physical commitment that expresses itself in footsteps and in the way doors interact with his arrival. The knock on the map room door was enthusiastic, not aggressive, just enthusiastic in the way of a person who has good news and wants the door to know it. The old Duke said something short. Ted entered. He was beaming, the beam of a man who has found something and knows it is good. His boots left a small but sincere amount of Norfolk agricultural reality on the stone floor with each step, which the old Duke observed without comment in the way of a man who has long since accepted that Ted and total cleanliness are engaged in a philosophical disagreement that will not be resolved in this lifetime. He was holding maps, a bundle of them, old cases, some I didn't recognize from the shelves, which meant they had come from somewhere else. He had found them, his gestures indicated with considerable enthusiasm, in a drainage shed on the far edge of the estate. He had known they were old. He had known they should come here. He had been proud of this decision all the way across the estate yard. He was holding them, I should mention, with one hand, tucked under his arm in the manner of a man carrying a rolled newspaper rather than, for instance, irreplaceable 200-year-old documents. The old Duke went very still. I have seen the old Duke in many situations over 11 years. I have seen him in rain. I have seen him in crisis. I have seen him watch Gerald the barn cat fall off a wall with an expression of complete philosophical acceptance. The stillness that came over him when he saw how Ted was holding those maps was a different category of still. It was the stillness of a man who is very carefully not reacting yet, because reacting now would require a speed that the situation does not benefit from. George went still too. He had been watching his grandfather all morning, in the way that children watch adults when they are trying to understand not just what is being done, but how to be. And he had absorbed enough in a few hours to know that what Ted was doing with his arm was the wrong answer to a question nobody had asked him. The sparrow, I considered briefly the structural integrity of my wall gap as an exit option. Then the old Duke spoke, calmly, the way you speak when you are choosing calm as a deliberate act rather than a natural state. And Ted, who is a good man and not an unintelligent one, looked at his arm, looked at the cases beneath it, and had what I can only describe as a moment of arriving fully in the present situation. He set the maps on the table, with both hands, very carefully. The old Duke thanked him, sincerely, for finding them, and then suggested, with the gentle firmness of a man who has been suggesting things gently and firmly for most of his adult life, that Ted might find his afternoon more productive in the kitchen garden. Ted agreed that this was probably true. He left. His boots said goodbye to the stone floor in their usual thorough fashion. The door closed. George looked at the cases on the table. The old Duke looked at the cases on the table. Then the old Duke reached for the nearest one and opened it with the particular care of a man who suspected, before he saw what was inside, that care was going to be necessary. He was right. Here is what I need you to understand about the maps Ted brought in from the drainage shed. They looked terrible. I do not mean this unkindly. I mean it as a factual description of their condition as visible to the naked eye, mine, which is quite sharp, or yours, which would have been. Water damage, significant warping. One case had partially failed along its seam, and the map inside had spent an indeterminate number of years in direct contact with a stone wall in a Norfolk drainage shed, which is, from a preservation standpoint, approximately the opposite of ideal. The old Duke went through them methodically. Each one unrolled with the same careful hands, each one assessed with the same unhurried attention. Some were familiar variants of maps already on the shelves, same surveys, later editions. Some were in better condition than their cases suggested, the cases having taken the worst of the shed environment on behalf of their contents in a small act of archival sacrifice. And then there was the last one. Even I could see it was in the worst shape of the collection. The case had not protected it at all. The case had given up at some point in the previous decade, and the map had been doing its best alone ever since. The lower third was a geography of water damage. There was warping. There was, in one corner, a bloom of something that had been mold and was now thankfully dry, but had left its record on the surface regardless. There was also, I noticed now, a boot print on the corner. Ted's, fresh, recent, the distinctive tread of a man who spends his days in the kind of boots that leave an impression. The old Duke unrolled it, with the tissue paper weighted at the corners. He looked at it. He was quiet for longer than he had been quiet about any of the others. George, who had been watching the assessment of each map with attention, noticed the quality of this particular silence and came to stand beside his grandfather. He looked at the map. He looked at his grandfather. His grandfather said something, short, then longer. Then he found something on the shelf, a reference book, old itself. its spine soft with use, and opened it to a page and set it beside the map and pointed between the two. What I pieced together, through the gap in my wall, through fragments of words and the body language of two people standing over a piece of damaged paper in a low-ceilinged room in Norfolk, was this. The map was an 1847 survey. Before a major Victorian restructuring of the Sandringham estate fields that had happened in the 1860s, someone had made a comprehensive survey of the original boundaries. Every field, every drainage channel, every boundary marker. In 1847, before everything changed. Historians, I learned this in fragments, through inference and 11 years of listening at walls, had known such a survey must have been commissioned. It was referenced in estate records. It was considered important enough to make notes about in other documents. But the survey itself had been assumed lost, probably destroyed in the restructuring, people had decided, or lost in one of the estate's various reorganizations over the following century and a half. It had been in a drainage shed, under Ted's arm, with a boot print on the corner. The old Duke looked at the boot print, he looked at the map, he looked at his grandson. George looked at the map, he looked at the boot print, he looked at his grandfather. Something happened in that moment that I find difficult to describe in the language available to a house sparrow, but which I will attempt anyway because I think it matters. It was the moment when the size of the thing settled onto both of them simultaneously. The weight of it. Not the weight of loss this time, but the weight of finding. The particular, almost vertiginous sensation of realizing that something everyone had stopped looking for was here, in this room, on this table, breathing. George said something. His grandfather said something back. And then, with a care that I have not seen applied to any object in 11 years of watching this estate, the old Duke began to assess the damage to the 1847 survey. Methodically, completely, without rushing, to understand what saving it was going to require. The assessment took 40 minutes. I counted. I have a good sense of time, birds do. It is one of our more reliable qualities. 40 minutes of the old Duke moving around the map with a magnifying glass, making notes in a small notebook in the same careful handwriting that appears in the estate records going back decades, while George stood at the correct distance and watched with the particular attention of a child who understands that watching is, right now, the thing being asked of him. Then the old Duke set down the magnifying glass and looked at his grandson. He said something, an explanation of what needed to happen, the tissue paper, the paste, the humidifier first to gently relax the warped sections before anything else, the sequence of it, the patience required by the sequence. The fact that this was a first session, that the full restoration would take not hours but weeks, done carefully, done in stages because the first principle remained, nothing that cannot be undone. George nodded. The old Duke picked up a brush. He began with the area of most significant damage, the lower third where the water had gotten in. He worked slowly. His hands, I noticed now with a clarity I had not applied to them before, were large hands, capable hands, hands that had done a great deal over a great many years, and that carried in their movements the confidence of accumulated experience. But the 1847 survey was in a fragile state that confidence could not negotiate with. I watched the old Duke's hands on the first brush stroke, and I watched him stop. Not because he made an error, because he felt the possibility of one, felt it in the way the paper responded, felt it with the nerve endings of a person who has handled enough fragile things to know when he is close to the edge of what his hands can do carefully enough. He set the brush down. He looked at the map. He looked at his hands. He looked at his grandson. There's a quality to the moment when an experienced person recognizes that experience is not the same as suitability for a particular task. It is not a comfortable quality. It asks something of a person, a willingness to set aside what they know they can do in order to honestly assess what the situation needs. It is the kind of quality that tells you a great deal about the character of the person managing it. The old Duke managed it without performance. He simply said something to George and held out the brush. George took it. He stood at the work table, the brush in his right hand, the map in front of him, the boot print in the corner which nobody had yet mentioned again, but which both of them were certainly aware of. The afternoon light coming through the outbuilding window at the angle it reaches in October in Norfolk, lower and more golden than summer, kinder in its way, less demanding. I pressed myself as close to the wall gap as I have ever pressed. George put the brush to the paste. He put the paste to the paper. He worked. I do not have a technical vocabulary for what I watched over the next 2 hours. I know what I saw: a small boy with a narrow brush and a piece of Japanese tissue paper moving along the damaged sections of an 1847 map that everyone had stopped looking for, with a slowness and a care and a patience that seemed, frankly, in excess of what you would expect from someone of his age doing something for the second time in his life. His hands were small. That was the simple physical fact of it. Small enough that the brush felt proportionate in them. Small enough that the movements required delicate, incremental, never more pressure than the paper was asking for, were movements his hands could make without effort, without the management of excess force that larger hands require when they are trying to be gentle. He sneezed twice, once at the 40-minute mark and once at 1:20, both times pulling the brush safely away from the paper in the split second before the sneeze arrived, with the reflexes of a child who had already learned in the course of this single afternoon that the paper was the thing that mattered. Both times he looked at his grandfather. Both times his grandfather looked at him with the expression of a man who is trying very hard not to smile. Both times they began again. By the time the afternoon light began to shift toward evening, that particular Norfolk shift where the gold goes out of the air and the blue comes in, George had stabilized 3 sections of the 1847 survey. Not repaired, not restored. Stabilized in the vocabulary of paper conservation, made secure enough that the damage would not progress, made ready for the next stage, which would happen another day. He set the brush down. He looked at what he had done. He looked at his grandfather. 3 maps stabilized. The 1847 survey, breathing. Ted redirected to the kitchen garden, where he was currently having what was, from the sounds filtering across the yard, a productive conversation with the vegetable situation. The afternoon, holding its last light over the Norfolk fields, those same fields that the map on the table had recorded in 1847 when they looked different, when the boundaries were drawn differently, when someone with careful hands and careful ink had decided that this mattered enough to document, that the present was worth the effort of preserving before it became the past. George was washing his hands at the small sink in the corner of the room. The old Duke was covering the map with a sheet of conservation-grade tissue, a different purpose now, protection rather than repair, and rolling the other 3 maps back into their cases with the same steady care. The room was quiet. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of completion, of a day that had done what it set out to do, or more than that, of a day that had found something it wasn't looking for and handled the finding with appropriate seriousness. George dried his hands. He came back to the table. He looked at the covered 1847 survey. He said something. The old Duke said something back. It was short. It was quiet. I caught the edges of it through my gap in the wall, not enough to transcribe, not enough to report with confidence, but enough to catch the register of it. The register of a man telling a child something true, not something comforting, not something encouraging in the soft, general way of encouragement. Something true, specifically, about what had happened today and what the small hands on the other side of the table had done with the afternoon they'd been given. George listened, and then I saw his face. I have been very careful in this account to stick to what I can actually observe. A sparrow's perspective is limited. I cannot read minds. I cannot hear through stone with perfect fidelity. I cannot know with certainty what passes between two people in the quiet of a map room at the end of an October afternoon. But I can see faces. I've been seeing faces for 11 years through this gap in the wall. I have seen faces in celebration and in difficulty and in the ordinary intermediate states that make up most of human experience. I know what a face looks like when it receives something it needed without knowing it was looking for it. George's face did that thing. And I, a house sparrow, not a romantic bird, 11 years a resident of this wall, allergic to sentiment and committed to observable fact, stayed very still in my gap in the stone, and did not move, and was glad I had not looked away. Part 8, The Sparrow's Reckoning. It is evening now. The map room is dark and locked. The estate yard is empty. The last of the October light has gone from the Norfolk sky, and the stars are beginning, tentatively, to show themselves above the flat fields, that big Norfolk sky that has no patience for anything less than total honesty, that simply is what it is and makes no apologies for the scale of it. I am back in my usual spot in the wall, warm enough, fed earlier on the things I found in the yard. I have been thinking, as birds do in the evenings, about what I watched today. I have watched this estate for 11 years. I have watched important people do important things. I have watched ceremonies and celebrations, and the small, steady work of keeping a large and old place alive. The repairs and the plantings and the management of seasons and the endless, patient negotiation with weather and time and entropy that caring for anything old requires. I have watched Ted carry things incorrectly across the estate yard more times than I can count. I have watched Gerald the barn cat fail to catch me with a consistency that deserves some kind of recognition. I have watched the field change with the seasons, and the light change with the hours, and the estate continue, year after year, being itself, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but with a persistence that I have come to understand is not stubbornness, but something more considered than that. A decision made repeatedly that it is worth the effort. But I have not, in 11 years, watched anything quite like what I watched today. A small boy chose to save something old. That is the simple version of it. That is the observable fact, stated plainly, without ornament. He chose it, not because he was told to, he was told what the maps were and why they mattered and how the work was done, but the choosing was his. The question he asked when he saw the damaged ones, the question that made his grandfather smile and go to the cupboard, that question came from him. From whatever part of a person it is that sees something in need of saving and asks, without yet knowing whether the answer is yes, whether it can be fixed. And he did the work, slowly, without rushing, with the particular patience of someone who has understood at some level that precedes full articulation, that the thing they are doing cannot be hurried without ceasing to be the thing they are doing, that the steadiness is not the obstacle to the saving, the steadiness is the saving. His hands were small, that helped, practically speaking. I will not pretend otherwise. There is something useful about small hands in delicate work, and the fact that his hands were the right size for the task is part of the story, not separate from it. But hands can be small and impatient. Hands can be small and careless. Small is not the same as steady. His hands were steady. And I keep returning to that, to the image of them through my gap in the wall, moving along the surface of a map that nobody knew still existed, with a brush no wider than a finger, doing something that could not be undone if it went wrong, and that he was not going to let go wrong, not out of fear, I don't think, but out of something that looked from the outside like respect. For the paper, for the people who made it, for the fields it recorded. For the fact that some things once lost are simply lost, and the ones you can still reach deserve the steadiness of your best effort. The 1847 survey will be restored, not quickly, in stages over weeks, done carefully, with the door always left open for the next person to correct what this person got wrong. That is the principle. That is the first and most important rule of caring for fragile things. Do nothing that cannot be undone. Leave the future its options. Trust that the work you do today is not the last word but a chapter in a much longer conversation between the thing and the people who love it. I think about that principle a lot, sitting in my wall in the evenings. I think it applies to more things than maps. Tomorrow, Ted will be back in the yard. Gerald will be in the kitchen garden, having whatever philosophical morning a retired barn cat has. The fields will be doing what Norfolk fields do in October, holding the light for the short time they have it, and then releasing it again, uncomplaining into the long evening. And somewhere on the estate, there will be an 1847 survey in a conservation box, 3 sections newly stabilized by the smallest and steadiest hands in the room, resting in the dark, holding its information safe for whoever comes next. That seems right to me. That seems like exactly the right place for it to be. My name is not important. I'm a house sparrow. I live in a wall. But I saw today, and I will not forget it. Some things are worth the effort of saving. The youngest hands are sometimes the steadiest. And the most important things that get found are usually the ones that everyone had already stopped looking for, found by people who walked into a room without knowing what they were about to do, asked the right question, picked up a brush, and began.